In the winter of 1943, in a labor camp above the Arctic Circle, a 35-year-old man stood in a coal mine shaft, 200 meters below the surface of the Earth. His name was Nikolai Kozyrev. He had been one of the Soviet Union's most promising young astrophysicists, published papers at 20, observatory appointment at 23, a future that seemed limitless. Now he was prisoner number 1442K at Norilsk, one of the deadliest camps in the Gulag system. He had no paper, no pencil, no books, no instruments. So he did something that should have been impossible. He began building an entirely new theory of physics inside his head. Not rough calculations, not fragments of ideas, a complete mathematical framework, equations, proofs, predictions, all constructed and stored in his memory for 11 years. 11 years later, he would walk out of the camps with a discovery so radical the Soviet government didn't know whether to celebrate him or silence him. 40 years after that, long after Kozyrev himself had died, Russian scientists decided to take his theories further than anyone had dared. They built something called Kozyrev's mirrors, aluminum chambers, cylindrical, polished to a specific curvature that his mathematics predicted would focus time energy. About 2 meters tall, wide enough for a single person to sit inside. Human subjects would enter these mirrors, sit in darkness, sometimes for hours, and when they emerged, they reported things that made the researchers stop writing, made them look at each other, made them wonder what they had built. Some described seeing events from the past with accuracy that could be verified. Some described receiving information from locations thousands of kilometers away. And some described contact with intelligences that did not feel human. The experiments ran for years, thousands of subjects, mountains of data, and then, without warning, they stopped. The records were classified. The researchers were reassigned. The subjects were sent home and told to forget what they had experienced. For nearly 3 decades, almost no one in the West has heard what happened in those laboratories. What did they find inside those mirrors? What made contact with the people who entered them? And why did Russia decide the world wasn't ready to know? This is the story of Nikolai Kozyrev, the physicist who survived the unsurvivable, the scientist who challenged everything we think we know about time, and the experiments that may have opened a door that should have stayed closed. Nikolai Kozyrev was born in 1908 in St. Petersburg, a city that would change its name 3 times during his lifetime. Petrograd, Leningrad, St. Petersburg again. From childhood, he was drawn to the stars, not with casual wonder, but with an intensity that unsettled the adults around him. By the time he was 20, he had published papers on stellar physics that caught the attention of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. By 23, he held a position at Pulkovo Observatory, one of the most prestigious astronomical institutions in the world. He published paper after paper: stellar atmospheres, planetary physics, the nature of solar radiation, each one building on the last, each one pushing further into territory that other scientists hadn't dared to explore, each one cementing his reputation as one of the brightest minds of his generation. He was 28 years old. He had a wife who loved him, a career that was flourishing, a future that seemed to stretch infinitely forward into decades of discovery and achievement. And then the knock came at the door. His colleagues called him brilliant. His professors called him gifted. The scientific journals called him the future of Soviet astrophysics, a rising star in every sense of the word. He published paper after paper: stellar atmospheres, planetary physics, the nature of solar radiation, each one building on the last, each one pushing further into territory that other scientists hadn't dared to explore. each one cementing his reputation as one of the brightest minds of his generation. He was 28 years old. He had a wife who loved him, a career that was flourishing, a future that seemed to stretch infinitely forward into decades of discovery and achievement. And then the knock came at the door. November 7th, 1936, the height of Stalin's Great Terror, a time when anyone could disappear, when a whispered accusation was as good as a death sentence. Kozyrev was denounced by a colleague, a man he had trusted. The charge was absurd. Participating in a counter-revolutionary organization, spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. The evidence? A private conversation about poetry. Nothing more. That was all it took. In Stalin's Soviet Union, a whispered word from an envious colleague could end your life, could erase your future, could send you to a frozen hell from which few ever returned. Kozyrev was taken from his home in the middle of the night. He would not see his wife again. He would not return to his observatory. He would not touch a telescope for more than a decade. His initial sentence was 10 years. He would serve 11. They sent him first to Dimitrovlag, a camp near Moscow, then further north, always further north, until finally he arrived at Norilsk, above the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Celsius, where the sun disappeared entirely for weeks at a time, where prisoners worked in nickel mines, breathing toxic fumes that turned their lungs black and shortened their lives to nothing. The mortality rate at Norilsk was staggering. Men froze standing upright. They starved with food still in their hands, too weak to lift it. They died of exhaustion, disease, and despair. They died because they simply gave up hope. But Nikolai Kozyrev did not die. Something else happened to him in those mines, something that no one expected, something that would change everything. Picture the conditions for a moment. No pen, no paper, no reference materials of any kind, no colleagues to discuss ideas with. Just the endless darkness of the mine shaft stretching in every direction. The cold that turned breath to ice the moment it left your lips. The slow crawl of hours that felt like years. Most men in Kozyrev's position focused on one thing and one thing only: survival. Getting through the next hour, the next day, the next winter. Kozyrev did something different, something no one else thought to do. He used mathematics as a survival mechanism. He used equations to keep his mind alive. Years later, he would describe it this way: I realized that if I stopped thinking, I would die. Not just physically, but spiritually. Something inside me would have broken forever. The equations kept me human. The mathematics kept me sane. And so, in the frozen darkness of a Siberian labor camp, surrounded by death and despair, Nikolai Kozyrev began constructing an entirely new theory of time. Not time as we usually think of it. Not a passive measurement. Not a simple backdrop against which events happen. But time as something active, something alive. Time as an energy. Time as a force that shapes reality itself. He calculated while he worked. He theorized while he slept. He built mathematical frameworks in his memory, checking and rechecking them during the long hours of forced labor. Each equation had to be perfect. There was no margin for error. He couldn't write anything down. If he forgot a variable, he had to start over from the beginning. Just his mind, the darkness, and 11 years of time. His theory began to take shape, piece by piece, proof by proof, year after year. Time, Kozyrev argued, is not merely a dimension. It's not simply the stage on which the universe performs. Time carries energy. It flows in specific directions. It interacts with matter and energy in ways we have never measured, ways we have never even thought to look for. He believed time had density, that it could be thick or thin depending on what was happening around it. He believed time could be focused, reflected, concentrated, possibly even manipulated. And he believed he could prove all of it, if he ever got out of the camps alive. In 1948, after 11 years in the Gulag, Nikolai Kozyrev was finally released. He had entered the camps as a promising young scientist of 28 with his whole life ahead of him. He emerged as a 40-year-old man with grey hair, broken health, hands that shook from years of hard labor, and a theory that existed nowhere except inside his own battered mind. Stalin was still alive. The purges were still happening all around him. Kozyrev could have disappeared again at any moment. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, one colleague who decided to report him. But he had something now that he hadn't had before. Something precious, a theory, and 11 years of absolute certainty that he was right. Now he just had to prove it to the world. In 1953, Stalin died. The tyrant who had sent millions to their deaths finally died in his own bed. Across the Soviet Union, millions of prisoners began to hope for the first time in decades. And slowly, painfully, the system began to release them, to acknowledge that perhaps some mistakes had been made. Kozyrev was officially rehabilitated. His criminal record was expunged. The charges against him were declared false. The colleague who had denounced him was himself exposed and disgraced. And Nikolai Kozyrev returned to Pulkovo Observatory, older, damaged. His hands shook from years of hard labor in the frozen mines. His lungs were scarred from the toxic dust he had breathed. But his mind was intact, sharp as ever. And inside that mind was a theory that had been waiting 11 years to finally be written down. In 1958, Kozyrev made a prediction that seemed completely absurd to everyone who heard it. He claimed the moon had active volcanic processes, that it wasn't a dead, cold, inert body, that it was geologically alive. The scientific establishment laughed at him openly. Everyone knew the moon was dead. It had been dead for billions of years. There was no heat source, no activity, no change. The idea was ridiculous. Kozyrev was dismissed, called a crank. His Gulag experience had damaged his mind, they said. He had spent too long in the darkness. He couldn't tell science from fantasy anymore. 20 years later, NASA's Apollo missions detected volcanic outgassing on the moon. Multiple studies in the decades since have confirmed ongoing geological activity. The moon was not dead. The moon had never been dead. Kozyrev was right. He had been right all along. Kozyrev built instruments, strange devices that looked like nothing else in any physics laboratory. He claimed these machines could detect the flow of time energy, could measure its density, could register its effects on physical processes. He conducted experiments that seemed to violate the laws of physics as everyone understood them. He claimed certain events could be detected instantaneously, faster than light should allow, because they were transmitted through time itself. Most Western scientists ignored him completely. His theories contradicted everything they thought they knew, everything they had been taught, everything they believed. But the Soviet military did not ignore him. They were paying very close attention to everything he did. And they were taking detailed notes. Akademgorodok, the academic town, a name that sounds almost innocent, built in the forests of Siberia, 30 kilometers from Novosibirsk, a planned city constructed specifically for scientists and researchers. a place where the Soviet Union's brightest minds gathered to work on projects that the rest of the world would never hear about. Within this complex stood the Institute of Experimental Medicine, and within the institute worked two men who would take Kozyrev's theories in a direction that even he might never have anticipated. Dr. Vladimir Kaznachev, member of the Russian Academy of Medical Sciences, decades of credentials, hundreds of peer-reviewed publications, a serious man with a serious reputation. Dr. Alexander Trofimov, equally credentialed, equally serious, focused on questions that mainstream science didn't want to ask. Questions about consciousness, questions about the nature of mind itself. They weren't looking for aliens or mystical experiences. They were investigating human consciousness using the tools of rigorous science. And they believed Kozyrev's theory of time might be the key to unlocking secrets that had eluded researchers for centuries. The mirrors themselves were deceptively simple in their construction. Cylindrical chambers made of polished aluminum sheets, rolled carefully into a specific spiral configuration according to precise mathematical specifications. About 2 meters tall when completed, just wide enough for a single person to sit inside comfortably. The theory, based directly on Kozyrev's published work, was that aluminum could focus and amplify what they called torsion fields, or time energy. The spiral shape was specifically designed to concentrate this energy around a human subject sitting at the center. Create a kind of lens, a lens for time itself. It sounded like science fiction. It sounded impossible. It sounded like something from a novel, not from a serious research institution. But these were serious scientists, with serious funding, from sources that were never fully disclosed to the public. And almost immediately, they began to get results that no one could explain. The first experiments focused on remote viewing, the ability to perceive distant locations without any physical connection. A subject would enter the mirror chamber, sit in the chair, close their eyes, try to empty their mind of all distractions. Miles away, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away, another person would concentrate intensely on a specific image, a location, a thought, a memory. The subject in the mirror would attempt to perceive it, to describe what they saw. According to the researchers' carefully documented reports, the accuracy rates were far above anything that statistical chance could explain. Subjects described locations they had never visited with uncanny, almost impossible precision. Streets, buildings, interior details, colors, shapes, objects that were sitting on tables at that exact moment. They drew symbols that matched target images exactly. They reported sensations and emotions that correlated perfectly with distant events happening in real time. The researchers documented everything with meticulous care. They controlled for every variable they could think of. They ran statistical analyses again and again. Something was happening inside those chambers, something real and measurable, something they couldn't explain through any conventional scientific framework. The experiments continued. Through the late 1980s, into the early 1990s, year after year, thousands of subjects from all walks of life participated. And as the data accumulated and the patterns became clearer, the researchers began documenting something they hadn't expected, something that went far beyond remote viewing. Subjects weren't just receiving information from distant locations in space. They were receiving information from somewhere else entirely, somewhere outside normal space and time. Multiple subjects, dozens of them, all independent of each other. No communication between sessions, no way to coordinate their stories. And yet they were all reporting eerily similar experiences. a sensation of time becoming fluid, past, present and future blurring together like watercolors bleeding into each other, the normal boundaries of perception dissolving, access to what they described as an information field, a vast repository of knowledge that seemed to exist outside normal space and time, something like a cosmic library that contained everything that had ever happened and everything that ever would. Visions of historical events they had no way of knowing about, details that were later verified through archival research, names, dates, specific facts that had been lost to history, and something else. Something that made the researchers pause before writing it down: contact. The researchers documented these reports as carefully as they documented everything else. They tried to remain objective, scientific, detached. Some subjects described encountering presences inside the mirrors, intelligences, minds, something that communicated with them without using words, without using sound, through pure meaning transferred directly into consciousness. Were these hallucinations? Subconscious projections, artifacts of sensory deprivation inside the chamber? Or were subjects actually making contact with something real, something that existed outside normal human perception? Some subjects described receiving specific information during these encounters: dates, names, technical details they had no prior knowledge of. Information that was later verified through independent research. Others reported warnings about the future, predictions, messages that seemed intended not just for them, but for humanity as a whole. A few subjects described the experience as transformative, enlightening, the most meaningful experience of their entire lives. Others described it as absolutely terrifying, as touching something that the human mind was never meant to touch, and some of them didn't recover. The researchers began documenting psychological effects that lasted long after the experiments ended, effects that didn't fade with time, difficulty distinguishing between normal perception and something else, intrusive thoughts that wouldn't stop, recurring visions that came unbidden, a sense that reality itself had become thin and unreliable. At least one subject reportedly suffered a permanent psychological break. Their mind never fully returned from wherever it had gone inside those mirrors. The researchers had built a machine to test a theory about time, a straightforward scientific experiment. Instead, they had opened something they didn't fully understand, and they were losing control of what came through. By the mid-1990s, the experiments had been running for years. The data was accumulating. The results were remarkably consistent. And someone, somewhere, at some level of authority that the researchers were never told about, decided that it had to stop, immediately, without explanation. The official explanation was funding cuts, simple budget constraints. Russia in the 1990s was an economic disaster of historic proportions. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The currency was worthless. Research programs across the country were being shut down left and right. Scientists were leaving for the West in droves. Entire institutes were being abandoned overnight. The Kozyrev mirror research was simply another casualty of the times, another program that couldn't survive the chaos. That was the official explanation, the story they told anyone who asked. But the timing raises questions that the official explanation doesn't answer. The experiments were showing consistent, reproducible results. Phenomena that, if verified by outside researchers, would fundamentally rewrite our understanding of consciousness, time, and reality itself. Why shut it down at precisely that moment? Why classify all the results? Why reassign all the researchers? Why tell the subjects to forget everything?
The official explanation was funding cuts, simple budget constraints. Russia in the 1990s was an economic disaster of historic proportions. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The currency was worthless. Research programs across the country were being shut down left and right. Scientists were leaving for the West in droves. Entire institutes were being abandoned overnight. Here's what we know for certain. The United States ran its own remote viewing program during the same period. Project Stargate, for over 2 decades, millions of taxpayer dollars, dozens of trained subjects, operational missions that remain classified to this day. When Project Stargate was finally declassified in 1995, the official conclusion was carefully worded. The results were ambiguous, not operationally useful, not worth continuing. But the program ran for 20 years. Someone in the government thought it was useful enough to keep funding for 2 entire decades. Multiple participants have since come forward claiming the program was far more successful than the government has ever admitted. The Kozyrev mirror research ran on an almost parallel track. Similar timeline, similar subject matter, similar methodology, similar sudden termination in the mid-1990s. Coincidence? Perhaps. But perhaps not. Some of the researchers involved in the Novosibirsk experiments are still alive today. A few of them have agreed to give interviews over the years. Dr. Alexander Trofimov, in particular, has spoken publicly about what he witnessed inside those laboratories. He describes the experiments as genuine scientific research, the results as consistent and verifiable by any objective standard, the implications as profound beyond measure. He also says the research was shut down for reasons that were never fully explained to him or any of his colleagues. We were told to stop. We were told to hand over all our data. We were told that this research would continue elsewhere, under different supervision. Whether it actually did or not, I honestly cannot say. Rumors persist to this day. Programs continuing under different names. Private funding replacing government support. Experiments happening outside any official oversight or public accountability. The mirrors may still exist somewhere. Someone may still be using them. We simply don't know.
Nikolai Kozyrev died in 1983. He never saw the experiments that would eventually bear his name. He never knew what the researchers at Novosibirsk would discover using his theories. He spent his final years working quietly at Pulkovo Observatory, still thinking, still developing theories that mainstream science continued to reject and ignore, still pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible. His colleagues remembered him as brilliant but isolated, a man who had seen too much darkness in his life, who had thought too deeply about questions that others preferred to leave alone, who had gone places in his own mind that others couldn't follow. He had survived the unsurvivable. 11 years in the Gulag, decades of scientific rejection and ridicule, the slow realization that his most important work would probably never be accepted during his own lifetime. And yet, he kept working. Every day, until the very end. So, where does this leave us? The Novosibirsk research was shut down and classified decades ago. The full data has never been released to the public. Most Western scientists still dismiss Kozyrev's theories as fringe physics, not worth serious consideration. And yet, certain facts remain stubbornly unexplained. Some of his predictions have been verified. The moon is not dead. Consciousness research is slowly, very slowly, becoming more respectable in mainstream scientific circles. And there are persistent hints that someone, somewhere, is still exploring what those mirrors can do. The researchers at Novosibirsk really did discover a way to access something beyond normal consciousness, a field of information, a form of contact, a doorway to something else entirely. Why didn't they share it with the world? Why isn't this being researched openly at every major university? Why does almost no one in the West know this story? Is it because the research failed, or is it because it succeeded? Nikolai Kozyrev spent 11 years in one of the most brutal prison systems ever created by human beings. He survived by doing mathematics in his head, by refusing to let his mind die even as his body was being destroyed. He emerged with a theory that mainstream science rejected completely. A theory they called impossible, absurd, the ravings of a damaged mind. And decades after his death, that theory led to experiments that allegedly produced results so profound, so disturbing, so far outside the boundaries of accepted reality that they had to be classified and buried. I don't have answers to give you, only questions. But I think these are questions worth asking. Questions that deserve serious investigation. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think really happened in those laboratories. Tell me whether you believe any of this is possible. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about suppressed research, forbidden knowledge, and the boundaries of what we think we understand about reality, subscribe, because I'm just getting started.